When my sister-in-law, Patricia, stood in my hospital room 3 months after the crash, holding a stack of legal documents and telling me I'd need a guardian because I was clearly incapable of managing my own affairs, I smiled and nodded. What she didn't know was that I'd already spent the past week quietly meeting with lawyers, financial advisors, and estate planners. While she was calculating how to divide my assets among the family, I was busy making sure she'd never see a single penny of what I'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from. If this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I was the successful owner of 3 boutique fitness studios in Portland, Oregon. I had built my business from nothing after moving to the city 8 years earlier, turning a single rented space in a strip mall into a thriving wellness empire that employed 15 people and served over 200 clients. I lived in a restored Victorian house in the Pearl District that I'd renovated myself, drove a Tesla Model S, and had an investment portfolio that would have made my late father proud. At 34, I thought I had figured out the formula for independence and success. Then came October 15th, a Tuesday that started like any other but ended with my life split into a clear before and after. I was driving home from a site visit for my 4th location when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of my car at 45 miles per hour. The impact sent my vehicle spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before it rolled twice and came to rest upside down against a concrete barrier. I woke up 4 days later in Oregon Health and Science University Hospital with a traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, a shattered left femur, and damage to my spinal cord that the doctors said would likely leave me with permanent mobility issues. The neurologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, explained in careful, measured tones that while my cognitive function appeared largely intact, I would need months of rehabilitation and might never walk without assistance again. The first week in the hospital was a blur of pain medication, physical therapy assessments, and a parade of medical professionals discussing my case in hushed tones, just outside my room. But it was the arrival of my family that truly showed me how dramatically my world had shifted. My older brother Marcus flew in from Denver, my younger sister Carmen drove up from Sacramento, and my brother's wife Patricia made the trip from their home in Seattle, all wearing expressions of concern that felt more calculating than compassionate. Marcus had always been the self-appointed family patriarch despite being only 3 years older than me. He worked in corporate finance and had a habit of speaking about money and investments as if everyone else in the room was financially illiterate. Patricia, his wife of 12 years, was a real estate attorney who specialized in estate planning and had never missed an opportunity to remind me that my business success was admirable but ultimately fragile compared to their more traditional career. Carmen, the youngest at 29, had struggled with addiction issues throughout her 20s and had recently gotten clean for the 3rd time. She worked sporadically as a freelance graphic designer but had never managed to maintain steady income or housing. I had helped her financially more times than I could count, paying for rehab programs, rent deposits, and car repairs with the understanding that family takes care of family. What struck me most during those first family visits wasn't their expressions of sympathy or concern for my recovery, but how quickly the conversation turned to practical matters. Marcus arrived with a briefcase full of documents and spent our first real conversation explaining how complicated it would be for me to manage my businesses while dealing with my injury. Patricia nodded along, occasionally interjecting legal terminology about disability trusts and power of attorney arrangement. Carmen sat quietly in the corner, but I noticed how her eyes lit up when Marcus mentioned the possibility of liquidating the fitness studios to ensure I had adequate funds for long-term care. She had been living in a studio apartment above a coffee shop and driving a car that broke down twice a month. The idea of financial security clearly appealed to her, even if it came at the expense of everything I had worked to build. Jean had been clear that my brain injury was relatively mild compared to what it could have been. I experienced some short-term memory issues and occasional difficulty finding words, but my reasoning abilities and judgment remained intact. However, my family seemed to focus exclusively on my physical limitations. The fact that I would likely need a wheelchair for mobility and assistance with some daily activities became in their minds, evidence that I was incapable of making major decisions about my life and finance. Patricia was the most vocal about this concern. During her second visit, she brought printed articles about the importance of establishing guardianships for disabled individuals and the legal vulnerabilities that could arise when someone with cognitive impairments tried to manage complex financial affairs. She spoke about me as if I wasn't in the room, explaining to Marcus and Carmen how traumatic brain injuries often affected judgment in ways that weren't immediately apparent. I listened to these conversations with growing alarm, not because I was confused or unable to understand what they were discussing, but because I realized they had already decided I was incapable of managing my own life. Patricia's legal expertise gave weight to her arguments, and Marcus's financial background made him feel qualified to assess my business decisions. Carmen, desperate for stability and still fragile in her recovery, was easily swayed by their certainty. The breaking point came during my third week in the hospital. I had been making good progress in physical therapy and was scheduled to be discharged to a rehabilitation facility the following week. My occupational therapist had been working with me on adaptive technologies and techniques that would allow me to continue managing my business operations from a wheelchair. I felt optimistic about my recovery and eager to get back to work, even if it meant making significant adjustments to how I operated. That's when Patricia walked into my room carrying a leather portfolio and wearing her most professional expression. She had drafted what she called a comprehensive care plan that would ensure my needs were met while protecting my assets from poor decision-making during my recovery. The plan included transferring power of attorney to Marcus, placing my business assets in a trust managed by Patricia's law firm, and selling my house to fund a more accessible living situation that she had already identified. She spread the documents across my hospital bed table as if she were presenting a business proposal to a client rather than discussing my life with me. The trust arrangement would provide me with a monthly allowance for living expenses while preserving the bulk of my assets for long-term care needs. Marcus would oversee all major financial decisions, and Patricia would manage the legal aspects of dissolving my business partnerships and selling my properties. What made the presentation particularly galling was how they framed it as being in my best interest. Patricia explained that traumatic brain injury victims often struggled with impulse control and poor judgment, even when their cognitive abilities seemed intact. Marcus added that the stress of trying to manage 3 businesses while dealing with my recovery would likely slow my healing and potentially lead to poor decisions that could jeopardize my financial security. Carmen sat in the visitor's chair nodding along, but I could see the relief in her eye. If my assets were placed in a family trust, it would mean security for all of us. She had never explicitly asked me for money since my accident, but I knew she was worried about her rent and had been hoping I might help her get back on her feet once I recovered. The trust arrangement would ensure she had access to family resources without having to ask. I looked at the 3 of them, arranged around my hospital bed: my older brother in his expensive suit and confident expression, my sister-in-law with her legal documents and authoritative tone, and my younger sister with her hopeful but guilty expression. They had arrived at a solution that felt reasonable to them, one that addressed their concerns about my capabilities while also providing financial security for the family. What they hadn't considered was that I might have my own opinion about how to handle my life and my assets. That night, after they had left and the hospital corridor had grown quiet, I lay in my bed, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I had spent 8 years building my business from nothing, learning to navigate the challenges of entrepreneurship, managing employees and clients, making decisions about investments and expansion. I had renovated my house myself, learning electrical work and plumbing, negotiating with contractors and dealing with city permits. I had handled my own legal affairs, managed my investment portfolio, and built a life that reflected my values and priorities. The car accident had changed my physical capabilities, but it hadn't changed who I was as a person. I was still the same woman who had moved to Portland with $2,000 and a business plan scribbled on napkin. I was still the person who had figured out how to turn a failed relationship and a career change into an opportunity to build something meaningful. The fact that I now used a wheelchair didn't erase 8 years of proven competence and good judgment. What bothered me most wasn't that my family was concerned about my well-being, but that they had made assumptions about my capabilities without consulting me. They had decided what was best for me and then presented it as the only reasonable option. Patricia's legal training and Marcus's financial background gave them confidence that their assessment was correct, but they had never asked me how I felt about my cognitive abilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, or what I wanted for my future. I spent the next few days observing my family's interactions more carefully. Marcus spoke about my businesses as if they were already dissolved, discussing which equipment could be sold and which clients might be transferred to competitors. Patricia had already contacted several real estate agents about listing my house and had identified 3 assisted living facilities that she thought would meet my needs. Carmen had started talking about maybe moving to Portland to help take care of me, though it was clear she was also interested in the cheaper cost of living compared to Sacramento. None of them asked me what I want. None of them inquired about my recovery goals or my plans for adapting my business operations. They had assessed my situation from their perspective and arrived at what they believed was the most practical solution. The fact that their solution also happened to provide financial benefits for each of them seemed to be a happy coincidence, rather than a primary motivation. But the effect was the same. Dr. Chin had been monitoring my cognitive recovery closely and had arranged for me to meet with a neuropsychologist to assess my decision-making capabilities. The evaluation involved several hours of testing that examined my memory, reasoning abilities, judgment, and executive function. When the results came back, they confirmed what I already knew. My cognitive abilities were largely intact, with only minor deficits in processing speed and short-term memory that were likely to improve with time. I asked Dr. Chin if she would be willing to speak with my family about her assessment of my capabilities. She agreed and arranged a meeting in the hospital conference room where she could present her findings and answer their questions. I expected this medical evidence would put an end to their concerns about my judgment and decision-making abilities. Instead, the meeting seemed to reinforce their conviction that I needed protection. Patricia peppered Dr. Chen with questions about the long-term effects of traumatic brain injury and the potential for subtle cognitive changes that might not be apparent in testing. Marcus focused on the physical challenges I would face and argued that the stress of managing complex business operations could interfere with my recovery. Carmen remained mostly silent, but I could see she was torn between supporting my independence and ensuring her own financial security. Dr. Chin was clear in her responses. My cognitive abilities were sufficient for managing my own affairs, my judgment was intact, and while I would face physical challenges, there was no medical reason I couldn't continue making my own decisions about my life and finance. However, she also acknowledged that recovery from traumatic brain injury could be unpredictable and that having family support would be beneficial. Patricia latched onto this last point and argued that the support they were offering through the trust arrangement was exactly the kind of family assistance Dr. Chen was recommending. Marcus added that removing the stress of financial management would allow me to focus on my physical recovery. They weren't questioning my cognitive abilities, they insisted, but rather trying to create the optimal conditions for my healing. After the meeting, I realized that no amount of medical evidence was going to change their mind. They had invested too much time and emotional energy in their plan to abandon it based on a doctor's assessment. More importantly, they had convinced themselves that their approach was genuinely in my best interest, which made it easy to dismiss any evidence that contradicted their conclusion. That evening, I called my longtime friend and former business partner Jessica Wong, who had helped me open my first studio and remained one of my closest advisors. Jessica was a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in disability advocacy, and she had been checking on me regularly since the accident. When I described the situation with my family, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Jessica explained that what I was experiencing was unfortunately common among people who acquired disabilities as adults. Families often struggled to adjust their perception of their loved ones' capabilities and sometimes made decisions based on fear and misunderstanding rather than actual limitation. She also pointed out that when significant assets were involved, financial motivations could complicate family dynamics even when everyone believed they were acting with good intention. She recommended that I consult with an attorney who specialized in disability rights and estate planning, someone who could help me understand my legal options and ensure my wishes were respected. Jessica also suggested that I might want to consider getting a second opinion on my cognitive assessment from a neuropsychologist who had no connection to my family, just to have independent documentation of my capability. Most importantly, Jessica reminded me that I had the right to make my own decisions about my life and my assets, regardless of what my family believed was best for me. She had seen too many people with disabilities lose control of their lives because well-meaning family members made assumptions about their capabilities. The key was to act quickly and decisively before my family could implement their plan. After talking with Jessica, I spent the rest of the night thinking about my options. I could continue trying to convince my family that I was capable of managing my own affairs, but it was clear they had already made up their mind. I could go along with their plan and hope to regain control of my assets later, but that would mean giving up my businesses and my independence with no guarantee I could get them back. Or I could take proactive steps to protect my interests while I still had the legal capacity to do so. The next morning, I asked my nurse to help me access the hospital's patient computer system so I could research attorneys in the Portland area who specialized in disability rights and estate planning. I also requested a private phone in my room so I could make confidential calls without my family overhearing. When Marcus arrived for his daily visit, I told him I was feeling tired and asked if we could postpone our conversation about the trust documents until the weekend. He seemed pleased that I was finally ready to discuss their plan seriously and agreed to give me a few days to rest and think things over. What he didn't know was that I was planning to use those few days to ensure that when we had our next conversation, I would be speaking from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. I had spent 8 years building a life that reflected my values and priorities, and I wasn't about to let a car accident and my family's good intentions take that away from me. If they thought I was helpless, I was going to show them exactly how capable I still was. But first, I needed to make some phone calls and get my own legal team in place. The rehabilitation facility where I would be spending the next 6 weeks was going to provide the perfect cover for what I had in mind. While my family thought I was focused on physical therapy and adjusting to my new limitations, I would actually be working with lawyers and financial advisors to ensure my assets remained under my control. By the time I was ready to go home, I would have everything in place to maintain my independence and continue building the life I wanted. Patricia had made one crucial mistake in her assessment of my situation. She had assumed that physical disability equated to mental incapacity. She was about to learn that underestimating someone based on their disabilities was not just ethically wrong, but also strategically foolish. I might need a wheelchair to get around, but my mind was as sharp as ever, and I was about to prove it. The discharge planning meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, 2 days before I was set to transfer to Cascade Rehabilitation Center. Patricia had arranged to attend virtually from Seattle, while Marcus planned to drive down from his hotel to participate in person. Carmen would be there as well, having extended her stay in Portland to help coordinate what she called my transition to supported living. I woke up that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt since the accident. Over the past 3 days, I had made a series of phone calls that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my recovery and my relationship with my family. While they had been planning my future based on their assumptions about my limitations, I had been quietly assembling a team of professionals who understood both my rights and my capabilities. My first call had been to David Nakamura, a disability rights attorney whose name Jessica had provided. David specialized in cases where families attempted to gain guardianship over adults with disabilities, who retained their decision-making capacity. During our initial conversation, he had been direct about the challenges I faced, but confident about my legal position. My neuropsychological evaluation clearly demonstrated my cognitive competence, and Oregon law required clear and convincing evidence of incapacity before a guardianship could be imposed. David had immediately begun documenting my situation, including recordings of our conversations that demonstrated my reasoning abilities and understanding of complex legal concepts. He also arranged for me to meet with Dr. Amanda Foster, an independent neuropsychologist, who could provide a second assessment of my cognitive function. Dr. Foster's evaluation, completed just yesterday, had been even more positive than the hospital's initial assessment, noting that my reasoning, judgment, and decision-making abilities were all within normal range. My second call had been to Margaret Chen, no relation to my neurologist, who was a certified financial planner specializing in asset protection for people with disabilities. Margaret had spent 2 hours on the phone with me, reviewing my business structure, investment portfolio, and current financial obligations. She had been impressed by the sophistication of my existing financial arrangements and saw no reason why my accident should require any changes to my asset management strategy. Margaret had also connected me with Thomas Rodriguez, a tax attorney who specialized in estate planning for business owners. Thomas had reviewed the trust documents Patricia had prepared and identified several provisions that would have been disadvantageous to my interest. The monthly allowance Patricia had calculated was less than half of what my businesses currently generated, and the trust structure would have made it difficult for me to access my assets even for legitimate business expenses. My third and most important call had been to Elena Vasquez. Yes, we shared the same first name, who was a business attorney specializing in disability accommodation and employment law. Elena had spent her career helping business owners adapt their operations after acquiring disabilities, and she had immediately understood both my situation and my goal. She had worked with me to develop a comprehensive accommodation plan that would allow me to continue operating my fitness studios while addressing my physical limitation. Elena had also introduced me to Michael Park, an occupational therapist who specialized in workplace accommodations for executives and business owners with disability. Michael had visited me at the hospital and spent 3 hours assessing my capabilities and discussing adaptive technologies that could enhance my productivity. His report, which Elena was preparing to present at today's meeting, concluded that with appropriate accommodations, I could continue managing my businesses at full capacity. The most crucial element of my preparation had been working with David Nakamura to establish what he called a preemptive legal framework that would protect my assets and decision-making authority. We had drafted new power of attorney documents that specifically revoked any authority I had previously granted to family members and designated David as my attorney-in-fact for legal matters only, with strict limitations on his authority. We had also prepared an advance directive that clearly stated my wishes regarding medical and financial decision-making. David had explained that Oregon law provided strong protections for people with disabilities who retained their cognitive capacity, but that families sometimes attempted to circumvent these protections by arguing that physical limitations created safety concerns that justified intervention. To address this potential argument, he had arranged for me to work with an independent living specialist who would assess my ability to live safely in my own home with appropriate modifications. The independent living assessment had been conducted by Sarah Kim, a certified rehabilitation counselor who specialized in home safety evaluations for people with mobility impairments. Sarah had visited my house while I was still in the hospital and had prepared a detailed report on the modifications that would be needed to ensure my safety and independence. The modifications were extensive but entirely feasible, and Sarah's report concluded that with appropriate adaptations, I could continue living in my home without assistance. As I prepared for the discharge planning meeting, I realized that my family's plan had a fundamental flaw. They had assumed I would be grateful for their intervention and willing to accept their assessment of my limitation. They had never considered the possibility that I might have my own ideas about how to handle my situation, or that I might have the resources and determination to implement those ideas. Marcus arrived at the hospital 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, carrying his usual briefcase and wearing an expression of confident authority. He had brought printed copies of the trust documents Patricia had prepared, along with what he described as a comprehensive financial analysis of my situation. Carmen was with him, looking nervous but determined to support whatever plan would provide her with the security she needed. Patricia joined the meeting by video conference, her image appearing on the large monitor in the hospital's family conference room. She had prepared what she called a legal overview of the guardianship process and the benefits of establishing a protective trust for someone in my situation. The hospital's discharge planner, a social worker named Jennifer Walsh, was also present to facilitate the discussion and ensure that all necessary arrangements were made for my transfer to the rehabilitation facility. Jennifer opened the meeting by reviewing my medical status and the goals for my rehabilitation program. She noted that my cognitive function had been consistently strong throughout my hospitalization, and that my physical therapy progress had exceeded initial expectations. She also mentioned that several members of my care team had commented on my active participation in planning my recovery and my clear understanding of the challenges I would face. Marcus thanked Jennifer for the update, and then launched into his presentation about the family's concerns regarding my long-term care needs. He explained that while my cognitive function might appear intact now, traumatic brain injuries often had delayed effects that might not become apparent for months or years. He argued that establishing protective measures while I was still competent would ensure that my interests were protected if my condition deteriorated. Patricia expanded on Marcus's presentation by discussing the legal vulnerabilities that people with disabilities faced when managing complex financial affairs. She cited several cases where individuals with traumatic brain injuries had made poor financial decisions that had jeopardized their long-term security. She also noted that the stress of managing business operations while dealing with physical limitations could potentially slow my recovery and increase the risk of complications. Carmen spoke last, focusing on the emotional aspects of the family's concern. She talked about how frightening it had been to see me in the hospital, and how much she worried about my ability to take care of myself. She expressed gratitude for Marcus and Patricia's willingness to take on the responsibility of managing my affairs, and emphasized how much the family loved me and wanted to protect me. Jennifer listened carefully to their presentations, and then asked me if I had any questions or concerns about the arrangements they had described. This was the moment I had been preparing for, and I took a deep breath before responding. I thanked my family for their concern, and acknowledged that their intentions were good. However, I explained that I had been conducting my own assessment of my situation, and had reached different conclusions about what would be best for my recovery and my future. I told them that I had consulted with several specialists who had evaluated my capabilities and developed recommendations for moving forward. Marcus interrupted to ask what specialists I was referring to, and I could see the concern in his expression as he realized I had been making arrangements without consulting the family. I explained that I had worked with a disability rights attorney, a financial planner, a business attorney, and several other professionals who specialized in helping people with disabilities maintain their independence and continue their career. Patricia's image on the monitor showed her leaning forward with a sharp expression as she asked why I felt it was necessary to consult with attorneys when the family was simply trying to help me. I responded that I wanted to ensure I understood all of my options, and that any decisions I made were based on accurate information about my rights and capability. I then asked Jennifer if it would be possible for my attorney to join the meeting by phone to present the assessment findings and recommendations. Jennifer agreed, and I called David Nakamura, who had been waiting for my call in his office across town. David's voice came through the conference room speaker with calm authority as he introduced himself and explained his specialization in disability rights law. He immediately established his credentials and his understanding of Oregon law regarding guardianship and capacity determination. He then began presenting the findings from the comprehensive evaluation that had been conducted over the past 3 days. David explained that multiple independent assessments had confirmed that my cognitive abilities were intact and that I retained full capacity to make decisions about my personal and financial affairs. He cited specific test scores and professional opinions that demonstrated my competence in areas including judgment, reasoning, memory, and executive function. He also noted that my understanding of complex legal and financial concepts had been thoroughly documented. Marcus tried to interrupt with questions about the qualifications of the professionals who had conducted these assessments, but David calmly provided detailed information about their credentials and experience. Amanda Foster, the neuropsychologist who had conducted the independent evaluation, was recognized as one of the leading experts in traumatic brain injury assessment in the Pacific Northwest. Patricia's voice came through the speaker with obvious tension as she questioned whether these assessments had taken into account the potential for delayed effects from traumatic brain injury. David acknowledged this concern but pointed out that Oregon law required decisions to be based on current capacity rather than speculation about future deterioration. He also noted that even if my condition were to change in the future, appropriate legal mechanisms existed to address those circumstances without requiring preemptive intervention. David then began describing the accommodation plan that had been developed to address my physical limitations, while preserving my independence and autonomy. He explained that Elena Vasquez had worked with occupational therapy specialists to identify specific modifications that would allow me to continue operating my businesses effectively. These modifications included adaptive technology, workplace accessibility improvements, and adjusted management protocols that would actually enhance my business operation. The accommodation plan was comprehensive and had been developed by professionals who understood both my industry and my specific needs. Michael Park's assessment had identified several areas where adaptive technology could improve my efficiency beyond what I had achieved before the accident. For example, voice recognition software and automated scheduling systems would streamline administrative tasks that had previously required significant time and energy. Elena Vasquez had also developed a legal framework for ensuring that my businesses remained in compliance with all applicable regulations, while implementing the necessary accommodation. This included updating employee policies, modifying physical spaces, and establishing protocols for client communication that would maintain the high level of service my studios were known for. David explained that the independent living assessment, conducted by Sarah Kim, had demonstrated that my home could be modified to ensure my safety and comfort while preserving my privacy and autonomy. The modifications included installing a residential elevator, widening doorways, adapting bathrooms, and creating accessible entrances. Sarah had also identified community resources and support services that would be available if I needed assistance with specific tasks. The most significant element of David's presentation was his explanation of the legal documents I had executed to protect my decision-making authority. He described the new power of attorney arrangements that specifically limited any authority that could be exercised over my affairs and established clear protocols for medical and financial decision-making. He also explained the advance directive that documented my wishes regarding future care and explicitly stated my desire to maintain my independence. As David concluded his presentation, the conference room fell silent, except for the sound of Patricia typing rapidly on her keyboard. Marcus was staring at his briefcase, as if the trust documents inside had somehow become irrelevant. Carmen looked confused and slightly hurt, as if she couldn't understand why I had made these arrangements without involving the family. Jennifer asked if I had any questions about the discharge planning process or the transfer to the rehabilitation facility. I explained that my attorney had been in contact with Cascade Rehabilitation Center and that arrangements had been made to continue the accommodation planning process during my stay there. I also mentioned that my business attorney would be coordinating with the rehabilitation team to ensure that I could begin gradually resuming my management responsibility. Marcus finally found his voice and asked why I felt it was necessary to take such dramatic steps when the family was simply trying to help. His tone was hurt rather than angry, and I could see that he genuinely didn't understand why I would reject what he viewed as a generous offer of support. I looked at him carefully before responding, choosing my words to convey both my appreciation for his concern and my determination to maintain control over my life. I explained that I understood the family's intentions were good, but that their plan was based on assumptions about my capabilities that weren't supported by medical evidence. I told him that I had worked too hard to build my independence to give it up based on speculation about what might happen in the future. Patricia's voice came through the speaker with obvious frustration as she pointed out that the legal arrangements I had made would prevent the family from helping me if my condition deteriorated or if I made poor decisions. She argued that by rejecting their protection, I was putting myself at risk and potentially jeopardizing not only my own future but also the family's financial security. This last comment revealed what I had suspected all along, that the family's concern for my welfare was intertwined with their own financial interests. Patricia's law firm would have earned substantial fees for managing the trust she had proposed. Marcus would have gained control over assets that could provide security for his own family, Carmen would have had access to resources that could stabilize her recovery and provide the support she needed. I addressed Patricia's concerns directly, explaining that the legal arrangements I had made actually provided more protection than the guardianship structure she had proposed. David had established mechanisms that would allow for intervention if my capacity were to become impaired. But these mechanisms required clear evidence of incapacity rather than assumptions based on physical limitation. I also pointed out that my new arrangements preserved my ability to provide support to family members while maintaining appropriate boundaries. David added that Oregon law specifically prohibited guardianship arrangements that were based on disability bias rather than actual incapacity. He explained that courts had consistently held that physical limitations alone could not justify removing someone's decision-making authority, and that speculation about future cognitive decline was insufficient grounds for preemptive intervention. Carmen finally spoke up, asking in a small voice whether my new arrangements meant that I wouldn't be able to help her anymore. Her question was heartbreaking, because it revealed both her vulnerability and her dependence on the family resources I had historically provided. I assured her that my desire to maintain my independence didn't mean I would stop caring about her welfare, but that any assistance I provided would be structured appropriately. I explained that part of my accommodation planning included working with a financial counselor who specialized in helping people with disabilities manage their resources responsibly. This counselor would help me develop guidelines for family financial assistance that would protect both my interests and the interests of family members who needed support. The goal was to create sustainable arrangements that didn't create unhealthy dependencies or resentment. Marcus asked whether I would be willing to consider a modified version of the family's plan that took into account my concerns about autonomy and decision-making authority. He suggested that perhaps we could work together to develop arrangements that would provide security for everyone while respecting my independence. David responded that any such arrangements would need to be based on my actual needs and preferences rather than assumptions about what would be best for me. He explained that disability rights law required that any support structures be designed to enhance autonomy rather than restrict it. He also noted that I retained the right to modify my arrangements at any time based on changing circumstances or preferences. Patricia asked whether I would be willing to have ongoing discussions with the family about these issues as my recovery progressed. She suggested that perhaps we could schedule regular family meetings to assess how things were going and make adjustments as needed. I agreed that ongoing communication would be beneficial, but I specified that any such discussions would need to be based on respect for my decision-making authority and recognition of my continued competence. I also requested that future conversations focus on how the family could support my goals rather than trying to convince me to adopt their preferences for my life. Jennifer concluded the meeting by reviewing the arrangements for my transfer to Cascade Rehabilitation Center and confirming that all necessary documentation had been completed. She noted that my accommodation plan would be shared with the rehabilitation team and that I would have the opportunity to continue working with my legal and business advisors during my stay there. As the meeting ended, Marcus approached me with an expression that mixed hurt, confusion, and grudging respect. He told me that while he didn't understand all of my decisions, he could see that I had given them careful consideration and had sought professional guidance. He asked if we could have a private conversation before I left for the rehabilitation facility. Patricia's image on the monitor had already disappeared, but Carmen lingered in the conference room looking uncertain about what had just happened. She asked if she could visit me at the rehabilitation center, and I assured her that she would always be welcome but that our relationship would need to be based on mutual respect rather than assumptions about my limitations. That evening, Marcus returned to my hospital room without his briefcase and business documents. He sat in the visitor's chair and asked me to help him understand what had happened to our family dynamic. He said he had always thought of himself as the protective older brother and couldn't comprehend why I would view his efforts to help as threatening or controlling. I spent nearly an hour explaining to Marcus how his approach had felt from my perspective. I described the experience of lying in a hospital bed while family members discussed my future as if I weren't capable of participating in the conversation. I explained how Patricia's legal documents had made me feel like a child whose parents were taking away her allowance rather than an adult who had successfully managed complex business and financial affairs for years. Marcus listened carefully and gradually began to understand how the family's good intentions had translated into actions that undermined my dignity and autonomy. He admitted that he had been frightened by my accident and had fallen back on familiar patterns of trying to solve problems through financial and legal structure. He also acknowledged that Patricia's expertise had given her opinions more weight than they deserved and that Carmen's needs had influenced their assessment of what would be best for me. By the end of our conversation, Marcus had agreed to respect my decision-making authority and to work with me to develop healthier family dynamics going forward. He also promised to talk with Patricia and Carmen about adjusting their expectations and approach. While I knew that changing established family patterns would take time and effort, I felt hopeful that we could build relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumptions about my capability. The next morning, I was transferred to Cascade Rehabilitation Center to begin the next phase of my recovery. As the ambulance pulled away from the hospital, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. I had gone from being the potential subject of a guardianship proceeding to being the architect of my own accommodation plan. Instead of having my assets placed in a trust managed by others, I had strengthened my control over my financial affairs while establishing appropriate protection. Most importantly, I had demonstrated to myself and my family that acquiring a disability didn't mean losing my identity or my capabilities. The car accident had changed my physical circumstances, but it hadn't changed my intelligence, my judgment, or my determination to live life on my own terms. If anything, the experience had strengthened my resolve to advocate for myself and to challenge assumptions about what people with disabilities could achieve. The rehabilitation facility was impressive, with modern equipment and a staff that clearly understood the importance of treating patients as whole people rather than collections of medical conditions. During my intake assessment, the social worker mentioned that my accommodation plan had already been reviewed by the rehabilitation team and that they were excited to work with someone who had such clear goals and such strong self-advocacy skills. As I settled into my room that evening, I called Jessica to update her on how the discharge planning meeting had gone. She was thrilled to hear that I had successfully protected my autonomy and impressed by the comprehensive nature of the legal and business arrangements I had made. She also reminded me that my experience could be valuable for other people with disabilities who faced similar challenges from well-meaning but misguided family members. That night, I fell asleep feeling more optimistic about my future than I had since the accident. I knew that the coming weeks would be challenging as I learned to navigate the world with my new physical limitations, but I also knew that I had the resources, the support, and the determination to continue building the life I wanted. My family's assumptions about my helplessness had been proven wrong, and I had shown them exactly how capable I remained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate my capability. But tonight, I was simply grateful that I had trusted my instincts and taken control of my situation before others could make irreversible decisions on my behalf. The accident had taken away my ability to walk, but it hadn't taken away my power to shape my own destiny. 6 weeks at Cascade Rehabilitation Center transformed not just my physical capabilities, but my entire perspective on what it meant to live with a disability. The facility's approach emphasized adaptation rather than accommodation, teaching patients to view their limitations as challenges to overcome rather than barriers that defined their potential. By the end of my first week, I was navigating the facility independently in my wheelchair and had begun working with the occupational therapy team to develop strategies for managing my businesses remotely. The rehabilitation program was intense, with physical therapy sessions every morning focused on building strength and endurance, occupational therapy in the afternoons addressing practical skills for daily living and work tasks, and evening sessions with counselors who specialized in helping patients adjust to life-changing injury. What impressed me most was how the staff consistently treated me as an expert on my own experience, asking for my input on treatment goals and respecting my assessment of my capabilities and limitations. Dr. Michael Torres, the physiatrist overseeing my care, had reviewed my accommodation plan during my first week and was enthusiastic about the comprehensive approach my legal team had developed. He explained that most patients struggled with the transition back to work because they hadn't adequately planned for the practical challenges they would face. My proactive approach to identifying and addressing potential obstacles put me well ahead of the typical recovery timeline. The business management component of my rehabilitation was particularly innovative. Elena Vasquez had arranged for me to work with Dr. Rachel Kim, an industrial psychologist who specialized in helping executives with disabilities optimize their leadership effectiveness. Dr. Kim spent hours observing how I processed information, made decisions, and communicated with others, then helped me identify strategies for leveraging my cognitive strengths, while compensating for any areas where the brain injury had created challenges. One of the most valuable aspects of working with Dr. Kim was learning to recognize and address the subtle ways that fatigue affected my decision-making capability. While my cognitive function had largely recovered, I discovered that extended periods of concentration could lead to mental exhaustion that impaired my judgment. Dr. Kim helped me develop scheduling strategies and workflow modifications that would prevent fatigue from compromising my business decisions. The adaptive technology training was revelatory. Michael Park, the occupational therapist who had assessed my workplace needs, introduced me to software and hardware solutions that actually enhanced my productivity beyond what I had achieved before the accident. Voice recognition programs allowed me to dictate emails and documents faster than I had ever typed them. Automated scheduling systems eliminated the time I had previously spent coordinating appointments and meetings. Project management software gave me better oversight of my business operations than I had ever had when I was trying to track everything manually. Perhaps most importantly, the rehabilitation team helped me develop what they called a disability identity that was based on empowerment rather than limitation. The social workers at Cascade worked with patients to help them understand that having a disability didn't mean being broken or incomplete, but rather meant having different capabilities that required different strategies for achieving goals. This shift in perspective was crucial for my psychological recovery and my confidence in returning to business leadership. During my third week at the facility, I received an unexpected visitor. Monica Hoffman, the owner of a chain of yoga studios in Seattle, had heard about my situation through mutual business contacts and wanted to discuss a potential partnership. Monica had acquired a spinal cord injury in a climbing accident 5 years earlier and had not only maintained her business operations, but had actually expanded them after implementing disability-focused accommodation. Monica spent an entire afternoon sharing her experience of transitioning back to business ownership after her injury. She described the initial challenges she had faced with employees, clients, and business partners who had questioned her ability to continue leading her company. She also explained how she had turned her disability into a competitive advantage by developing specialized programs for clients with disabilities and creating the most accessible yoga facilities in the Pacific Northwest. What struck me most about Monica's visit was her confidence and enthusiasm for her work. She spoke about her business with the same passion and expertise that I remembered feeling before my accident, and she made it clear that acquiring a disability had enhanced rather than diminished her effectiveness as a leader. She also provided practical advice about managing employee concerns, addressing client questions, and maintaining professional credibility in a business environment that often made assumptions about disability and competence. Monica's visit reinforced my determination to return to my fitness studios as soon as possible. She helped me understand that my concerns about how clients and employees would react to my disability were normal, but manageable. She also pointed out that the fitness industry was increasingly focused on inclusive and adaptive approaches to wellness, which meant my experience with disability could actually attract new clients and enhance my business's reputation. During my fourth week at Cascade, I began conducting business meetings via video conference from the Rehabilitation Center. Elena Vasquez had worked with my studio managers to establish protocols for remote decision-making that allowed me to maintain oversight of operations while focusing on my recovery. These initial meetings were challenging because I was still learning to manage fatigue and cognitive demands, but they proved that I could continue leading my business effectively. The response from my employees was overwhelmingly positive. My 3 studio managers had been concerned about the future of the business after my accident, but seeing me engaged and articulate in our video conferences reassured them that continuity would be maintained. Several employees mentioned that my determination to return to work inspired them and reinforced their commitment to the company's mission of helping people achieve their fitness goals. Client reactions were more varied but generally supportive. Some clients expressed concern about my ability to continue providing the personalized attention they valued, but most were impressed by my commitment to maintaining service quality despite my circumstance. A few clients actually requested to work with trainers who had experience with adaptive fitness techniques, viewing my situation as evidence that the studios were committed to serving people with diverse abilities and needs. The most significant challenge during this period was managing my family's ongoing concerns about my decision to return to work so quickly. Carmen visited regularly and was generally supportive, but she continued to express worry about whether I was pushing myself too hard. Marcus called weekly and gradually became more accepting of my choices, though he still occasionally suggested that I consider selling the business and focusing solely on my recovery. Patricia remained the most resistant to my independence. She sent several emails, questioning the wisdom of my legal arrangements and suggesting that I reconsider the protective trust structure she had originally proposed. Her communications were always framed in terms of concern for my welfare, but I could detect underlying frustration that her expertise had been rejected in favor of other legal counsel. David Nakamura had warned me that family resistance often intensified when people with disabilities began demonstrating their continued competence. He explained that families sometimes invested so much emotional energy in the narrative of needing to protect their loved one that evidence of independence felt threatening rather than reassuring. He advised me to remain patient, but firm in maintaining my boundaries while the family adjusted to my new circumstances. The turning point in family dynamics came during my 5th week at Cascade, when Carmen brought her 8-year-old daughter Sophia to visit. Sophia had been anxious about seeing me since the accident, and Carmen had been unsure about whether the visit would be too upsetting for her. Instead, Sophia was fascinated by my wheelchair and the adaptive equipment in my room, asking detailed questions about how everything worked and whether I could teach her to use some of the technology. Sophia's natural acceptance of my disability and her genuine interest in my recovery process seemed to shift something in Carmen's perspective. After Sophia fell asleep during our visit, Carmen told me that seeing her daughter's reaction had helped her realize that her own fears about my disability had been based more on stereotypes than reality. She apologized for not being more supportive of my independence and promised to be a better advocate for my choices going forward. During my final week at Cascade, I participated in what the facility called a real-world integration program that involved spending full days outside the rehabilitation center while maintaining my therapy schedule. This program allowed me to test my adaptation strategies in actual business and community environments, while still having access to professional support if challenges arose. My first integration day involved visiting all 3 of my fitness studios to assess the physical accessibility and identify necessary modifications. Sarah Kim, the independent living specialist, accompanied me on these visits to provide technical expertise about accessibility requirements and to help me develop implementation timelines for necessary change. The studio visits revealed that while my facilities were generally accessible, several modifications would significantly improve both safety and functionality. These included installing accessible parking spaces, widening certain doorways, modifying reception desk heights, and creating accessible changing areas. More importantly, the visits allowed me to reconnect with the physical spaces that had been central to my identity as a business owner and to envision how I would navigate them in my wheelchair. The emotional impact of returning to my studios was more intense than I had anticipated. Walking, or rather rolling through the spaces I had designed and built, triggered a complex mix of grief for what I had lost and excitement for what I could still achieve. The studios looked exactly as I had left them, but my relationship to them had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the person who could demonstrate every exercise or lead every class, but I was still the person who understood the business and could guide its continued growth. My second integration day focused on community activities and errands that I would need to manage independently. This included grocery shopping, banking, visiting my accountant's office, and meeting with vendors and suppliers. Each activity provided opportunities to practice the strategies I had learned for navigating physical barriers, managing fatigue, and advocating for my needs in various environments. The grocery shopping expedition was particularly educational because it forced me to confront the practical realities of daily living with a wheelchair. Simple tasks like reaching items on high shelves or maneuvering through crowded aisles required new strategies and sometimes assistance from store employees. However, I also discovered that many stores had accessibility features I had never noticed before, and that most people were willing to help when asked politely. The meeting with my accountant, Jennifer Walsh, not the hospital social worker but a different Jennifer, was professionally significant because it demonstrated my continued ability to engage with complex financial information and make informed business decisions. Jennifer had been managing my business taxes and financial reporting for 3 years, and was familiar with the sophistication of my operation. She spent 2 hours reviewing my financial position, discussing tax implications of my medical expenses, and planning for the business modifications I would be implementing. Jennifer's assessment was that my accident would have minimal impact on my financial stability and might actually provide tax advantages through disability-related business deductions. She was impressed by the comprehensive legal and financial planning I had completed, and noted that my proactive approach to accommodation planning demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had made my business successful. My third integration day involved conducting full business operations from my home office, which had been modified according to Sarah Kim's recommendation. The modifications included a height-adjustable desk, improved lighting, and reorganized storage systems that would allow me to access everything I needed from my wheelchair. The goal was to demonstrate that I could manage all aspects of my business operations without assistance. The day began with a video conference with my studio managers to review weekly performance reports and discuss upcoming program launches. This was followed by individual meetings with each manager to address specific operational challenges and provide guidance on client service issues. I also conducted interviews with 3 potential new trainers, reviewed marketing materials for our spring fitness programs, and participated in a planning meeting for the 4th studio location I had been considering before the accident. The most challenging aspect of the day was managing my energy and attention levels during back-to-back meetings and complex decision-making tasks. Dr. Kim's fatigue management strategies proved essential for maintaining my effectiveness throughout the day. Regular breaks, strategic scheduling of high-concentration tasks, and careful monitoring of my cognitive state allowed me to complete everything on my agenda without compromising the quality of my decision. By the end of the integration day, I felt confident that I could resume full business operations while continuing my recovery. The accommodations and strategies I had learned were effective, and my cognitive abilities were clearly sufficient for managing the complex demands of business ownership. More importantly, I had demonstrated to myself that my identity as a successful entrepreneur was intact, despite my physical limitations. The discharge planning process at Cascade was comprehensive and forward-looking. Torres reviewed my progress and confirmed that I had exceeded all recovery expectations for both physical and cognitive function. He noted that my proactive approach to accommodation planning and my strong support network positioned me well for continued success in my personal and professional life. The rehabilitation team provided detailed recommendations for ongoing therapy and support services that would help me maintain my progress and address any challenges that might arise. These included monthly check-ins with an occupational therapist, quarterly assessments with Dr. Kim to refine my business management strategies, and access to peer support groups for business owners with disabilities. Elena Vasquez had coordinated with the rehabilitation team to ensure a smooth transition back to full business operation. She had scheduled follow-up meetings with all of my professional advisors and had arranged for ongoing consultation services as I implemented the accommodation plans we had developed. She also provided me with a comprehensive resource guide for disability-related business issues and connected me with a network of other business owners with disabilities who could provide peer support and advice. On my final day at Cascade, I participated in what the facility called a graduation ceremony, where patients who were completing their programs shared their experiences and offered advice to people who were just beginning their recovery journey. Speaking to newer patients about my experience was both humbling and empowering, as it reinforced how much I had accomplished and how much I had learned about resilience and adaptation. The drive home from the rehabilitation center was emotionally significant because it marked the beginning of my fully independent life with a disability. David Nakamura had arranged for a modified vehicle that would allow me to drive safely and comfortably, and learning to use the adaptive controls had been part of my rehabilitation program. Being able to drive myself home felt like reclaiming a fundamental aspect of my independence. My house looked exactly as I had left it, but the accessibility modifications that had been completed during my rehabilitation stay made it feel like a completely different space. The residential elevator that had been installed allowed me to access all 3 floors of my Victorian home, and the bathroom and kitchen modifications made it possible for me to maintain my privacy and independence while ensuring my safety and comfort. The most emotionally powerful moment was rolling my wheelchair into my home office and seeing the space that had been redesigned to accommodate my needs while preserving the aesthetic I love. The height-adjustable desk allowed me to work comfortably for extended periods, and the reorganized storage systems made everything easily accessible. The space felt both familiar and new, reflecting the way my entire life had been transformed by the accident and my response to it. That evening, I called Jessica to let her know I was home and to thank her for all of the support and guidance she had provided throughout my recovery. Jessica was thrilled to hear about my progress and impressed by everything I had accomplished in just a few months. She also reminded me that my experience could be valuable for other people with disabilities who faced similar challenges, and she encouraged me to consider sharing my story through speaking engagements or writing. The next morning, I drove myself to my primary fitness studio for my first day back as the hands-on owner and operator. The staff had organized a small welcome back gathering, and several of my regular clients had arranged their schedules to be there when I arrived. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with employees and clients expressing genuine excitement about my return and curiosity about how my experience would influence the studio's programs and services. My first day back involved observing classes, meeting with individual clients, and working with my managers to implement some of the new programs we had discussed during my rehabilitation. I was particularly excited about launching adaptive fitness classes that would serve clients with disabilities and chronic health conditions, drawing on my personal experience and the expertise I had gained during my recovery. The day was physically and emotionally demanding, but it confirmed that I could successfully manage my business operations while continuing to recover from my injury. My employees were supportive and impressed by my determination, and clients were interested in learning about the new services and perspectives I could offer based on my experience with disability. 2 weeks after returning home, I received a call from Patricia requesting a family meeting to discuss what she called ongoing concerns about my decision-making and business management. She had spoken with Marcus and Carmen and felt that the family needed to address what she viewed as my unrealistic expectations about my capabilities and my refusal to accept appropriate support. I agreed to the meeting but specified that David Nakamura would attend as my legal representative and that the discussion would focus on facts rather than opinions about what was best for me. I also requested that the meeting take place at my home office so that Patricia could see firsthand the accommodations I had implemented and the effectiveness of my current arrangements. The family meeting was tense, but ultimately productive. Patricia arrived with documentation of what she described as concerning decisions I had made, including my choice to return to work so quickly, my refusal to accept family financial oversight, and my decision to launch new business programs despite my recent trauma. She argued that these choices demonstrated poor judgment and suggested that I was not fully recovered from my brain injury. David methodically addressed each of Patricia's concerns by presenting evidence of my continued competence and the success of my business operations since returning home. He provided documentation of client satisfaction, employee retention, revenue stability, and operational efficiency that demonstrated my effectiveness as a business leader. He also presented the assessments from multiple medical and rehabilitation professionals, who had confirmed my decision-making capacity. Marcus and Carmen listened carefully to the presentations from both sides, and gradually began to understand that their concerns were based more on fear and misunderstanding than on actual evidence of problems with my judgment or capability. Marcus admitted that seeing me in my home office, clearly engaged and effective in managing my business, had challenged his assumptions about what disability meant for professional competence. Carmen was more emotional in her response, explaining that she had been terrified of losing me, and had convinced herself that the safest approach was to protect me from any potential risks or challenges. She apologized for not recognizing that her attempts to protect me had actually been undermining my autonomy and self-determination. Patricia remained skeptical but acknowledged that the evidence of my continued competence was compelling. She agreed to withdraw her recommendations for guardianship proceedings, but requested that I consider establishing some form of family oversight or consultation process that would allow relatives to monitor my well-being and provide input on major decisions. I explained that while I valued family relationships and wanted to maintain open communication, any such arrangements would need to be based on respect for my autonomy, rather than assumptions about my limitations. I offered to provide regular updates on my business operations and personal well-being, but I made it clear that decision-making authority would remain entirely with me, unless and until medical evidence indicated otherwise. The meeting concluded with what felt like a tentative truce rather than full resolution, but it established clearer boundaries and expectations for family relationships going forward. Patricia agreed to respect my legal arrangements, Marcus committed to supporting my business decisions, and Carmen promised to focus on celebrating my achievements, rather than worrying about potential problems. 3 months after returning home, I was invited to speak at a disability rights conference about my experience with family resistance to independence and self-determination. The opportunity to share my story with other people who had faced similar challenges was both therapeutic and empowering, as it reinforced that my experience was part of a larger pattern of disability discrimination that needed to be addressed through education and advocacy. The speaking engagement led to additional opportunities to share my experience through workshops, support groups, and professional organizations. I discovered that my story resonated with many people who had faced assumptions about their capabilities based on their disabilities, and that my success in maintaining my independence provided hope and practical guidance for others in similar situations. 6 months after my accident, my fitness business was more successful than it had ever been. The adaptive programs I had launched were attracting new clients and generating positive media attention for the studio's commitment to inclusive fitness. The accommodations I had implemented had improved efficiency and accessibility for all clients, not just those with disability. Most importantly, my experience with disability had deepened my understanding of the challenges people faced in achieving their fitness goals, and had made me a more effective and empathetic business leader. The most significant change in my life was not my physical limitations, but my enhanced appreciation for the importance of self-advocacy and determination. The accident had forced me to confront assumptions about disability and competence that I had never questioned before, and my successful resistance to family control had strengthened my confidence in my own judgment and capability. My relationship with my family had evolved into something healthier and more respectful than it had been before the accident. Marcus had become genuinely supportive of my business decisions and often sought my advice on his own professional challenge. Carmen had entered a new phase of her recovery and was pursuing her graphic design career more seriously, inspired by my example of overcoming obstacles through determination and planning. Even Patricia had gradually begun to acknowledge that my legal arrangements had been wise and that my continued success demonstrated the effectiveness of my decision-making. While our relationship remained somewhat formal, she had stopped questioning my competence, and had even referred other clients to my legal team when they faced similar challenges with family resistance to their independence. 1 year after my accident, I celebrated by hosting a party at my primary fitness studio for all of the people who had supported my recovery and my fight for independence. The gathering included my rehabilitation team, my legal and business advisors, my employees and clients, and my family members, who had learned to respect my autonomy. The event was both a celebration of my personal achievements and a demonstration of how much my life had been enriched by the relationships I had built through advocating for myself. As I looked around the room at people who had supported my journey in different ways, I reflected on how the accident had ultimately led to a stronger and more authentic version of myself. The trauma had been devastating, but my response to it had revealed capabilities and resilience I hadn't known I possessed. More importantly, my success in maintaining my independence had challenged stereotypes about disability and had inspired other people to advocate for their own rights and capability. The experience had taught me that being called helpless was not a reflection of my actual abilities, but rather a reflection of other people's limitations in understanding what disability meant. By refusing to accept their assessment and instead demonstrating my continued competence, I had not only protected my own interests, but had also contributed to broader social understanding of disability and independence. My new will, the one I had carefully crafted with David's help, remained unchanged and unchallenged. The document reflected my values and priorities and ensured that my assets would be distributed according to my wishes, rather than other people's assumptions about what was best for me. More importantly, the process of creating that will had been an act of self-determination that had established the foundation for all of the independence and success that followed. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I remained in my office, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had been lying in a hospital bed a year ago, listening to family members discuss her future as if she were incapable of participating in the conversation, had become someone stronger and more confident than she had ever been before. The accident had taken away my ability to walk, but it had given me something even more valuable, an unshakable understanding of my own worth and capabilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.